Why had her hands betrayed her? Riley had spent 8 careful months disappearing into the rhythm of routine, 8 months of pretending to be invisible, just another civilian contractor at Fort's weapons inspection facility, logging serial numbers, cleaning rifles, calibrating scopes. To the others she was Level 2 clearance, a face in khaki, a name on a badge, nothing more. But that morning, under the hum of fluorescent lights and the metallic chorus of rifles being checked and disassembled, her hands told a different story. They moved with an elegance that didn't belong to an office-bound contractor. Each adjustment of the scope turret carried the weight of long nights on foreign, waiting for a target to appear. Each deliberate movement echoed training honed not in classrooms, but in the mountains of places the Army never officially admitted existed. And then there were the gloves. The black fabric was worn thin at the fingertips, molded to the shape of someone who had lived with a rifle as if it were a limb. To most, they were ordinary tactical gloves, the kind anyone might pick up from surplus. But stitched in dark gray thread across the back was an emblem, faint, almost invisible, a skull rising from mountain peaks, crossed rifles etched beneath. Major James Henderson saw it. His coffee froze halfway to his lips, his clipboard forgotten in his hand. Because that symbol wasn't supposed to exist. Not anymore. Ghost Division. The name alone made seasoned officers lower their voices. A unit erased from official records 3 years ago. Declared dead, all of them, after a mission no briefing dared to describe. And yet, here it was, stitched into the gloves of a woman everyone believed was just another contractor. Henderson's heart beat louder than the clatter of bolts and cleaning rods around him. He had been in the Army long enough to know what discretion meant, but recognition carried its own weight, a burden you couldn't unsee. He looked at her again. Riley, civilian contractor, auburn hair tied in a regulation bun. No insignia on her uniform, no medals, no scars on display. And yet, every inch of her posture whispered a truth the paperwork had hidden. Special operators carried themselves differently. Even in a safe, sterile room, their bodies remained coiled ready. They never turned their back fully, never reached for a tool without knowing where their exits were. Henderson saw it all now, as if the emblem had sharpened his vision. Her fingers slid across the rifle's bolt, and instead of a loud click, it closed with a hushed whisper, deliberate and practiced. Why silence a bolt in a maintenance bay, unless silence had once meant survival? "Morning status report," Henderson said, his voice casual, betraying none of what churned beneath. 47 rifles cleared inspection, she replied evenly. 3 needed sight realignment, 2 required trigger adjustments, and 1 barrel flagged for replacement. Precise, crisp, delivered like an after-action briefing. Henderson wrote it down, though his eyes lingered longer than they should have. She must have felt it because she finally looked up. For just a moment their eyes locked. And Henderson saw it, that unmistakable gaze. The gaze of someone who had seen men die in silence, who had counted seconds by heartbeats, who had carried the unbearable knowledge that sometimes only one person walks away. His chest tightened. Ghost Division had no survivors. Not one. That was the official line. If this woman was who he thought she was, then everything he'd been told, everything filed into neat folders with red, classified stamps, was a lie. She broke the silence first. "Is there something else you need, sir?" Her tone was calm, respectful, but he heard it, the undercurrent. A test. A readiness for whatever came next. "No," Henderson said finally. He forced his voice into neutrality, into routine. "Carry on with your work." She nodded and returned to the scope, but Henderson noticed her body shift just slightly. Enough to watch him from the corner of her eye. Enough to free her hands in case she had to move fast. He walked back to his office, each step heavier than the last. His coffee had gone cold. His clipboard blurred before his eyes. "Report it," procedure whispered in his head. "You saw something you shouldn't. Report it." But another voice rose louder. She had been here for 8 months, competent, tireless. Every weapon she touched left the base sharper, more reliable, more likely to keep a soldier alive. If she was Ghost Division, if she had survived what killed the rest, then maybe she deserved this fragile anonymity she had built. But the insignia, the gloves, a mistake. He had seen them, and now the choice wasn't just hers anymore. Riley felt the weight of his gaze long after he disappeared. She cursed herself silently. She had grown too comfortable. 8 months of blending in had dulled her edge. Those gloves, they weren't vanity. They were necessity. They covered scars, calluses that would raise questions. Still, she should have stripped the insignia off long ago. She thought no one would notice. She was wrong. Her hands moved across the next rifle, steady as ever. Outwardly, she was calm. Inside, her mind raced. If Henderson reported her, her cover would last hours, maybe days. She had extraction plans, backup identities, safe routes. She could vanish. She had done it before. But the thought of leaving this life cut deeper than she expected. For the first time in years, she had something like normal. A job where her skill didn't mean killing. A purpose that wasn't wrapped in shadows. Every rifle she checked wasn't just steel, it was a promise. Soldiers deserved equipment they could trust. And she had learned too late what it meant when trust failed. The memory hit her before she could push it down. The mountains, the ambush, Ghost Division's last mission. She could still feel the vibration of mortar blasts in her chest, smell the smoke, taste blood and dust. She remembered the sound of the helicopter sputtering, the chaos as it spiraled down, and the silence afterward, too much silence. They had all been declared dead. She was supposed to be dead too, buried under wreckage, half-conscious, listening to enemy voices laugh as they executed the wounded. Only luck or fate had kept the metal beams over her still. She had crawled out 3 days later, hunted and already erased from the world. The army had given her a choice back then. Stay buried, accept a pension, disappear forever, or step back into the light, debrief, and become a tool again. She had chosen to stay a ghost. Until now. Henderson's eyes had changed everything. By 1100 hours, she had completed 3 more rifles. Henderson emerged from his office on his routine inspection walk. She didn't look up, but every nerve braced. He paused by her station, clipboard in hand, his voice level. "Progress report, how many this morning?" 12 rifles, 3 machine guns, she said smoothly. All cleared within parameters. He wrote it down, but his words lingered. "Your accuracy improvements continue to impress. Soldiers appreciate weapons they can depend on." She caught the weight in that phrasing. Soldiers, combat. He wasn't just talking about maintenance anymore. She looked up, meeting his gaze, and for the first time she let the mask slip, just a fraction, enough steel in her voice to make her meaning clear. "Sir, if you have concerns about my background, I'm prepared to address them through appropriate channels." It was a gamble, a line drawn without drawing it. Henderson didn't blink. He studied her, the ghost sitting across from him, and after a long silence said quietly, "I have no concerns about your work performance." His words were chosen carefully, each one balanced on a knife's edge. None at all. She held his gaze for another heartbeat. He had seen her, he knew, and he had made his choice. For now, at least. She exhaled slowly, forcing her hands steady as she returned to her work. But inside, the weight shifted. Her cover wasn't safe anymore. Henderson's silence was fragile. One wrong move, one wrong word, and the ghosts of her past could consume her life again. Still, for the first time since the mountains, Riley felt something she hadn't expected. Not fear. Hope. Because Henderson could have destroyed her with a single sentence, but he hadn't. He had looked into her eyes, seen the truth, and chosen silence. Maybe redemption wasn't a fantasy. Maybe the past didn't always have to win. She cleaned the barrel of another rifle, the insignia on her gloves catching the harsh light, a shadow of a unit the world had buried. And she thought, Perhaps ghosts weren't meant only to haunt. Sometimes they were meant to protect. What does survival really cost? Riley had asked herself that question every night for 3 years. Not in words exactly, more in the fragments of memory that replayed whether she wanted them to or not. The smell of cordite in thin mountain air. The sound of rotor blades turning into screams. The faces of teammates she couldn't save. That morning at Fort, as she slid another sniper rifle across the inspection table, the weight of Henderson's silence still pressed against her ribs. He had seen too much, understood too much. And though he had chosen discretion, she knew it was only a matter of time before the past demanded its due. The rifle in front of her wasn't just steel and glass, it was memory. Her hands moved across the scope, adjusting windage by instinct. She didn't mean to fall back into that night in Afghanistan, but the weapon pulled her there. Ghost Division's last mission had been simple on paper. It always was. A fortified compound, a high-value target, elimination before he could orchestrate another wave of attacks, remote valley, high altitude, hostile population. The kind of job that regular units weren't equipped to touch. That was why Ghost Division existed, because plausible deniability sometimes required soldiers who officially didn't. She had been Team 3's designated marksman. Her role was overwatch, distance, precision, the invisible presence that tilted the odds in favor of her brothers and sisters moving in on the ground. She could still feel the jagged rock beneath her as she set up her rifle on the outcropping. It was the perfect vantage point textbook, wide fields of fire, elevation advantage, a sniper's dream. Until it became a coffin. The first shots hadn't come from her. They came from the valley floor, heavy machine guns opening up from positions the intel had sworn were clear. Mortars followed, bracketing her team with terrifying precision. Riley had seen ambushes before, but this wasn't just resistance, it was orchestration. Someone had tipped them off. Her radio filled with chaos, shouts, calls for cover, screams cut short by static. Ghost Division was trained for the impossible, but this was slaughter. Riley's crosshairs found targets faster than she could breathe. A gunner in a nest down. A mortar team lining up down. Another figure moving for an RPG down. Her shots were clean, merciless, automatic. But for every man she dropped, two more emerged. The valley seemed to birth enemies from the earth itself. She had never fired so fast, never felt so useless. Her spotter had gone silent after the second barrage. She didn't look over. Couldn't. She had to keep shooting, keep buying seconds. Seconds were life. But seconds weren't enough. When the helicopter came, it wasn't rescue. It was desperation. A bird pushed into a kill zone, blades glowing under tracer fire. Riley scrambled down from her perch, sprinting through smoke and blood to reach it with the last survivors. She remembered their faces in flashes, bleeding from his shoulder, half dragging another man. She couldn't even remember his name now. That guilt alone was a weight she carried daily. The bird lifted for a heartbeat. Then it bucked, twisted, metal shrieking. RPG fire had torn it open. The ground came up fast. She woke to darkness, heat, pain so sharp it blurred into white noise. She couldn't move. Something heavy pinned her chest. For a long time she thought she was already dead. Then came the voices. Enemy fighters moved through the wreckage, flashlights cutting arcs in the smoke. She heard their laughter, their casual tone as they ended the suffering of the wounded. One shot, then another, then silence. She held her breath. Blood ran into her eyes. A beam of light swept across her boots and passed. She didn't move, couldn't. Hours crawled by before she realized the twisted rotor assembly above her had shielded her from discovery. By the time she clawed her way out, the valley was crawling with fighters. She ran, or stumbled, or crawled, the memories blurred into each other. 3 days, no food, barely water, a concussion that left the world tilting at every step, and yet somehow she made it to the border, to a safe house. To a new name, a new file, a new life. Ghost Division was dead. That was the line. Every briefing, every report, every file. The official truth was a lie carved in stone. But Riley lived, and living meant carrying ghosts. At Fort, her fingers trembled against the rifle stock, just for a second. She forced them still, forced the memory back down where it belonged. No one around her noticed. No one ever did. Except Henderson. She could feel his eyes even when he wasn't looking. A soldier knew when they were being watched. And though he said nothing, she understood what silence meant in the military. Silence wasn't peace. Silence was a countdown. The question that haunted her now wasn't whether Henderson would report her. It was whether she should leave before he did. She had plans, always did, passports, cash, routes mapped, safe houses primed like tripwires across the country. She could be gone by sundown if she wanted. Riley could vanish, replaced by someone else, someone new. But as she looked at the rifles lined on her table, freshly calibrated and ready for soldiers who would carry them into unknown firefights, she felt the tug of something deeper than survival. She had built this life not just to hide, but to redeem. Every bolt tightened was a promise that some 19-year-old wouldn't have to die the way had. Walking away meant abandoning that, and she wasn't sure she could anymore. Survival had a cost, but so did purpose. That evening she packed her tools slowly, her gloves heavy with meaning. She left the facility as the sun sank over the base housing. Families laughed in the yards. Kids chased each other in the fading light. She paused, watching them, her chest aching in a way combat never prepared her for. This was what soldiers died for. Not flags, not orders, not lines on maps. This, laughter at dusk, safety without vigilance, life unburdened. And maybe, just maybe, that was worth risking exposure. She walked back to her apartment, each step echoing the ghosts that followed. Henderson's choice lingered like a held breath. He knew, she knew he knew, and yet neither of them had spoken truth aloud. Tomorrow, perhaps, silence would break. For now, Riley chose to live with it. Because she had learned in the mountains and the fire that survival was never free. It demanded payment in memories, in sacrifices, in pieces of yourself you couldn't get back. But here, with her hands still steady on rifles that would keep others alive, she thought maybe, just maybe, the price had been worth it. What happens when silence isn't enough anymore? Riley had been living inside a fragile truce. She knew it. Major Henderson knew it. Their shared secret lingered like smoke in the air, invisible to everyone else, but suffocating to those who had breathed it in. For weeks the rhythm at Fort held steady. Rifles in the morning, reports at noon, clipboards, checklists, maintenance logs. Henderson played his role as the disciplined officer. Riley played hers as the competent, anonymous contractor. Neither acknowledged what simmered beneath. It might have lasted longer. It might have endured if not for the inspection. Colonel Hawthorne. The name alone carried weight. A career intelligence officer, rumored for her precision, her unshakable eye for detail, and her refusal to let irregularities slide. Riley remembered her from briefing packets in another life, photos clipped into folders stamped classified. They had never met in the flesh, but Riley knew her reputation. A hawk circling the perimeter of secrets. And now she was here. Officially, Hawthorne was conducting a routine assessment of civilian contractors at Fort. In reality, her arrival sent ripples through every hallway, every office, every maintenance bay. Soldiers adjusted their uniforms a little sharper. Contractors double-checked their files. Henderson's jaw tightened when he read the announcement. Riley, she felt her pulse settle into that old, familiar rhythm, the one she hadn't needed since Afghanistan, the rhythm of pre-combat. She was ready, but she didn't want to be. The colonel walked the facility with quiet authority, gray hair in a tight bun, eyes sharp enough to catalog every detail in a glance. She asked questions that sounded simple but weren't. She cross-checked performance reports against paperwork. She didn't miss anything. Riley noticed how the room seemed to contract when Hawthorne entered. Conversations quieted. Pens froze mid-signature. Even Henderson, steady as ever, carried tension in his shoulders when he briefed her. Riley kept her head down, but she knew it wouldn't last. People like Hawthorne didn't miss anomalies. And Riley, no matter how polished her cover, was an anomaly in flesh. It didn't take long. On the third day of the inspection, the list came out. Personnel flagged for individual interviews, civilian contractors among them, and there, in crisp black ink, was her name, R. The paper felt heavier than it should when she read it. She had been waiting for this moment for years, dreading it, rehearsing contingencies. Yet when the time came, she felt strangely calm. She arrived at the temporary office at 1400 hours, uniform neat, gloves on, posture professional. She walked in as if she belonged. That was half the battle. Colonel Hawthorne sat behind the desk, files stacked like walls between them. She gestured politely. "Miss, please have a seat." Riley sat, hands folded lightly on her lap, calm, alert. "I've reviewed your file," Hawthorne began, voice smooth but sharp. "Your performance has been exceptional. Reports show increased reliability in field weapons since your arrival. Soldiers trust the equipment you've maintained. That's no small achievement." "Thank you, Colonel," Riley replied evenly. "I find the work rewarding." Hawthorne nodded, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Rewarding, that's good, because your results suggest a level of expertise uncommon among civilian contractors. Where did you receive your training?" The first cut, sharp, deliberate, Riley felt it but didn't flinch. "I've always had a mechanical aptitude," she said, truth tucked inside half-truth. "Completed technical programs, hands-on experience. It's a skill set that translates well." The colonel made a note, her pen scratching like a scalpel. She looked back up, eyes piercing. "Your file shows a history of relocation. Several states, short spans of time. That kind of mobility often indicates someone avoiding entanglements. Should I be concerned?" Riley held her gaze, steady as stone. She recognized the tactic. Interrogators called it the open window. Give the subject a chance to step through, to confess, to trip. "No, ma'am," Riley said simply. "I've moved for work opportunities and personal reasons. Nothing that affects my clearance." Another note, another silence. For 20 minutes, Hawthorne carved questions out of casual phrases. Training programs, previous jobs, personal history. Each one laced with the precision of someone who knew what didn't add up. Riley answered smoothly, carefully, not with lies but with fragments that fit the cover she'd built. When the interview ended, Hawthorne closed the file slowly. "Thank you, miss, this has been helpful." Riley rose, nodded, and walked out, her pace steady, but inside she felt the walls closing. Because she knew what had just happened. Hawthorne wasn't convinced. That evening, back in her apartment, Riley sat in silence. The kind of silence that hummed louder than noise. Her small living space, once a sanctuary, now felt like a cage. Every object looked temporary, the kind of possession you could leave behind without regret, because she might have to. She pulled out the phone she kept hidden, powered it on, dialed a sequence. The line clicked once, then held. She spoke in coded phrases, the kind only one kind of person would understand. She hadn't touched these protocols in years, but tonight she couldn't afford not to. Status, compromised, prepare contingency. It was all she said, all she needed to say. She hung up, staring at the gloves on the table. The skull emblem, faint under the lamplight, seemed to stare back at her, a reminder of who she was, of what she had lost, of what she still couldn't escape. The next day, security at the facility shifted. More patrols, more controlled access, subtle but obvious to trained eyes. Riley noticed the way soldiers lingered near doors, the way communications hummed a little longer, the way her movements were tracked. Hawthorne was tightening the net. By noon, the message came: enhanced background verification. Riley read the words on the official slip, but she didn't need them. She had known the moment she saw the colonel's eyes in that interview. Enhanced verification meant classified database access, files that weren't supposed to see daylight, files where Riley did not exist, but Sergeant First Class Riley, Ghost Division, did. Time, that was the only question now. Hours, days, how long before the truth bled out of the paper? At 1700, Major Henderson appeared at her workstation, his tone casual, his presence anything but. He said quietly, "Conference room B, paperwork matter, 5 o'clock." She glanced at him. His eyes carried urgency beneath the calm. She nodded. "Yes, sir." She finished her shift like nothing was wrong, packed her tools, walked the hall with a steady step, but inside her chest was fire. At 1700 sharp, she opened the door to conference room B. Henderson was waiting, documents spread across the table. He gestured for her to close the door. His face was tight, his voice low. "We have a problem." Riley stood across from him, silent. "Hawthorne has requested files," he continued. "Classified files, Ghost Division, Afghanistan, survivors." The word struck harder than mortar fire. Survivors. Her breath slowed, controlled. How long before she sees them? 48 to 72 hours, Henderson replied. Less if she pushes priority, and she will. Silence filled the room, heavy, suffocating. Riley finally spoke. "Then my cover is gone." Henderson met her eyes. "Not necessarily. We can try another way. Evidence, performance records, proof that your presence here serves a greater purpose than protocol." He slid the documents across. Commendations, reports from field units praising the improved reliability of their weapons, letters noting that lives had been saved because rifles worked when they should have failed. "Your work has prevented casualties," Henderson said. "That matters, it should matter." Riley looked at the papers, the weight of them heavy in her hands. Proof of value, proof of purpose, but would it be enough against the weight of secrecy, against the truth of Ghost Division? She set the papers down, meeting Henderson's gaze. "If she forces the issue, I'll take responsibility. You won't pay the price for my silence." His voice was firm, unwavering. "I knew what I was doing when I chose not to report you, and I'd make the same choice again." For the first time in a long time, Riley felt something twist inside her chest. Not fear, not despair, something closer to gratitude. Henderson leaned closer. "There may be one chance, an informal discussion. If Hawthorne agrees, you'll have to be honest, completely, no more masks." Riley thought of the helicopter, the bodies, the mountain air filled with fire. She thought of the years she'd lived as a shadow, hiding even from herself. And she thought of the rifles lined on her bench, the soldiers who carried them, the families who waited at home. Her voice was quiet, steady. "Then I'll tell her the truth." The words hung there, heavy as judgment. Because sometimes silence isn't enough. Sometimes survival demands a different kind of courage. What happens when truth is the only weapon left? The morning arrived shrouded in fog, thick, gray, unsettled, as if the sky itself carried the weight of the decision to come. Fort looked smaller beneath it, buildings fatting at the edges, movements muffled. Riley arrived 30 minutes earlier than usual, not because she needed the time, but because she couldn't sit still in her apartment 1 minute longer. She worked through rifles like a machine, sighting, tightening, cleaning, adjusting. Every click of a turret, every swipe of cloth felt sharper, more deliberate, as though she were leaving a trail of last testaments. If this was her final morning as Riley's civilian contractor, then her work would go out flawless. Soldiers she'd never meet would depend on these weapons. They would never know who had inspected them, whose hands had made sure the steel sang true. But that was fine. Ghosts weren't meant to be known. At 10:45 hours, she set down her tools. Her heart beat steady, like the thrum of rotor blades. Henderson appeared in the hallway, briefcase in hand. He didn't say anything he didn't need to. His eyes spoke enough. They walked together in silence to the administrative wing, each step echoing with the weight of inevitability. Colonel Hawthorne's temporary office was guarded by 2 soldiers. The door was shut. Henderson nodded to them, then opened it, gesturing Riley inside. The colonel sat behind a desk stripped bare except for a folder and a recorder. The blinds behind her were tilted, throwing bars of pale light across the room. Her posture was straight, her gaze unflinching. She gestured, "Please, sit." Riley sat. Henderson settled beside her, laying the briefcase on the table. His hand brushed the clasp but didn't open it yet. Hawthorne spoke first. "Miss, I agreed to this informal discussion at Major Henderson's request. This is your opportunity to clarify certain irregularities. I expect honesty. Half measures will end this meeting very quickly." Her voice was cool, professional, not hostile, not yet. Riley nodded once, understood. "Then let's begin," Hawthorne said, leaning slightly forward. "Your file presents a civilian with exceptional technical skill. Your performance suggests otherwise. Where exactly did you learn to handle weapons the way you do?" Riley's throat tightened. For 3 years she had built walls around this truth. Now she let them fall. "My name is Riley," she began slowly, her voice even but weighted. "But before this life I was Sergeant First Class Riley, U.S. Army Special Operations, Ghost Division." Henderson didn't move. Hawthorne's eyes narrowed. The room seemed to contract, silence pressing into every corner. "Ghost Division was dissolved 3 years ago," the colonel said flatly. "All personnel were declared killed in action. Afghanistan, a helicopter crash under fire." Riley met her gaze. "That's the report, the official truth, but it's not the whole truth. I survived." For the first time, Hawthorne's composure shifted, not broken but recalibrated. "Explain." So Riley did. She told it plain, stripped of embellishment, the overwatch position, the sudden ambush, the impossible numbers pouring from the hills, the desperate helicopter, the crash. She described the weight of metal pinning her chest, the hours listening to enemy voices move through wreckage, executing survivors. How silence had saved her when nothing else could. How she had crawled out days later, broken but breathing, dragging herself across hostile terrain until she reached a border-safe house. Her voice faltered once, just once, when she spoke of her team. Of's blood, of's hands slipping from hers in the fire. Of the names that never left her even if the army had erased them. Hawthorne listened, expression unreadable, pen poised but unmoving. When Riley finished, the silence stretched long. Finally the colonel spoke. "Assuming your story is true, why hide? Why vanish? Survivors are debriefed. Debriefings save lives." Riley inhaled, slow, steady, "Because my survival wasn't convenient." Her words landed heavy. "They needed Ghost Division to stay dead," she continued. "Admitting I lived would have meant questions about the mission, about the leaks, about why a unit was sent into a kill box, so they gave me a choice. Disappear or become a pawn again. I chose to disappear." Hawthorne tapped her pen once against the folder. "And these past 3 years, why here? Why Fort?" Riley glanced at the briefcase Henderson carried. He gave a subtle nod. She reached across, opened it, and slid a stack of papers across the desk. Reports, letters from field commanders, maintenance records. "My past was built on taking life," she said quietly. "This was my chance to save it. Every weapon I maintain here isn't just steel. It's a promise. That when a soldier pulls the trigger, it works. That someone comes home. That maybe another family doesn't get a folded flag." Hawthorne flipped through the documents. Commendations, notes from combat units, reports of fewer malfunctions, fewer failures, tangible lives saved by hands once trained to kill. The colonel set the papers down, folding her hands over them. Her eyes met Riley's. "You understand what this means. You understand that protocol was broken. That what you did, creating a false identity, entering this facility under deception, is a violation of everything I'm sworn to protect." Riley didn't look away. "I do." "And yet," Hawthorne paused, her voice tightening, "your record here is extraordinary, your impact measurable. That cannot be dismissed." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was calculation. Riley knew it. She had seen commanders weigh lives like this before, numbers on scales, protocols against outcomes. Henderson broke it. His voice was steady but carried weight. "Colonel, her work has saved soldiers. I've seen it. I've read the letters. Men and women are alive because of her. That matters more than paperwork." Hawthorne's gaze flicked to him. "And you, Major, knew about this. You failed to report it." The air thickened. Henderson didn't flinch. "Yes, because I judged her by her actions here, not the shadows of her past, and I'd do the same again." Riley's chest tightened. She hadn't expected him to risk himself like that. Hawthorne leaned back, studying them both. Her expression gave nothing away, but her eyes were sharp, calculating. "You both understand the precedent this sets. If I allow this, I undermine protocols designed to keep this military secure. If I don't, I discard someone whose value is proven in ways I can't ignore." Riley exhaled slowly. "Colonel, I'm not asking for recognition or forgiveness, just the chance to keep working, to serve in the only way I can without destroying what's left of me." The words hung there. For a long moment Hawthorne said nothing. The clock ticked on the wall. The fog outside thinned slightly, light seeping in. Finally the colonel spoke, her voice quieter than before. "Miss, your situation requires official resolution, but I believe resolution can take different forms. You've proven your worth. You've also proven your risk. The question is which weighs heavier." She closed the folder, stood. "You'll hear from me soon." And just like that, the meeting ended. Riley and Henderson walked out together, the air between them taut with everything unspoken. Soldiers passed in the hallway, oblivious to the storm that had just shifted direction behind that closed door. Back in the inspection bay, Riley picked up another rifle, her hand steady though her chest trembled. The decision was out of her hands now. Survival, redemption, all of it rested on the judgment of a woman who saw the world in absolutes and exceptions. Riley knew this. Ghosts didn't often get second chances. But maybe, just maybe, she had earned one. What do you do when your life hangs in someone else's silence? Riley had walked out of Colonel Hawthorne's office with her spine straight, her steps measured. To anyone watching, she looked calm, controlled, just another contractor leaving a routine meeting. But inside, her pulse still thudded in her ears, heavy as mortar fire. She had laid it all bare, the crash, the escape, the years of hiding, the gloves on her hands, the ghosts she carried. Henderson had put his own career on the line beside her. And now nothing. No verdict, no sentence, just waiting. Waiting was worse than fire. The fog had lifted by the afternoon, but the air inside the inspection bay still felt thick. Riley returned to her bench, tools laid out in perfect rows, rifles stacked in regulation order. She tried to lose herself in the work, but every adjustment carried the weight of finality. This rifle might be the last she touched here. This report the last she logged under the name. Across the room, Henderson moved through his routine. Clipboard, conversations with other contractors, but she saw it in his shoulders, the way they carried tension, the way his eyes flicked to her more often than they should. They both knew the truth. They were no longer in control. By evening, the base felt different. Soldiers still walked the hallways, families still gathered outside housing units, kids still rode bikes along sidewalks. But for Riley, everything had shifted. Every glance felt sharper, every sound louder. The air itself seemed to press against her skin. She went home, locking the door behind her. The apartment was quiet, too quiet. She moved through it slowly, looking at the objects she had allowed herself, a stack of paperbacks, a mug with a chipped handle, a single framed photo of a sunrise she once watched alone on the coast. Nothing that couldn't be left behind. Because she might have to. She pulled out the secure phone again, her extraction line, her last resort. She pressed the sequence, the one she'd memorized years ago and prayed she'd never use. The connection was brief. A voice answered with a code phrase. Status. Riley spoke in clipped words. Possible compromise, 72 hours. There was a pause, then, assets ready, 12-hour notice required. She hung up, setting the phone face down on the table. The weight of that decision, even speaking those words, sat like lead in her chest. Extraction meant survival, yes, but it also meant obliteration. Riley would vanish. Again. A new name, a new city, a new mask. The fragile redemption she'd built here, the quiet purpose in keeping soldiers alive through her work, gone. She poured a glass of water and sat at the edge of the bed. For a long time she stared at her gloves on the nightstand. The skull insignia caught the lamplight, faint but sharp enough to cut her. Those gloves had betrayed her, and yet they had protected her too. They were a reminder of what she'd survived and of the hands she'd never hold again. She whispered their names. Daniel's, names etched deeper into her bones than any insignia. Ghost Division was gone, but they lived on in her silence. The next morning at Fort, nothing looked different, but Riley felt it the way a soldier feels weather turning before the clouds arrive. Security was thicker. Checkpoints. She moved through the facility with care, her senses stretched wide. By mid-morning, Henderson found her. He approached casually as though asking for a routine update, but his eyes told another story. She hasn't decided yet, he murmured, low enough that no one else could hear. Riley kept her gaze on the rifle in her hands. And when she does? Henderson's jaw worked, the words he wanted to say caught between duty and loyalty. Finally, then we adapt. Adapt, the soldier's creed, the ghost's survival. She nodded, her hands steady on the weapon though her chest tightened. The day passed like a test of patience. Riley performed each inspection with flawless precision, each log entry neat and exact. She spoke little, moved little, but watched everything. Every shift in security detail, every subtle movement in the colonel's orbit. At noon, she caught sight of Hawthorne herself across the facility floor. The colonel moved with the same sharp efficiency as always, clipboard in hand, speaking with supervisors. But Riley felt the weight of her eyes, not when they looked at her, but when they deliberately didn't. The colonel was thinking, calculating, and Riley's fate was the equation. By evening, back in her apartment, Riley sat at the table with a small notebook open. She had written nothing in it for months. Now she put pen to paper. Not reports, not codes, just words. Fragments of memory, not for anyone else, for herself. She wrote about the sound of the rotor blades that night. About's last laugh, the one he made over comms when a mortar landed too close. About's hand slipping away. About the moment she realized survival didn't feel like victory. The ink blurred once when a tear hit the page. She let it sit, didn't wipe it. Ghosts deserved their marks. On the third day, news came. Not official, not direct, but whispered through Henderson, passed in a glance and a few measured words. She's requesting more files. Riley froze. What kind? After-action reports, casualty records, photos. The blood drained from her face. Photos. If Hawthorne pulled those, there would be no hiding. Her face would stare back from a classified archive marked KIA. And then the only question would be, why was a dead soldier still breathing at Fort? That night, Riley didn't sleep. She packed a small bag, clothes, cash, papers. She tucked the gloves inside, wrapped carefully as if they were relics. She left the bag by the door, ready for 12-hour notice. But when dawn broke, she was still there, still waiting, still hopping for something she had no right to hope for. Because Henderson had been right, there was another way. If Hawthorne could be convinced that her presence here was an asset, not a liability, maybe the cycle didn't have to repeat. Maybe she didn't have to vanish again. Maybe she could live with the truth in the open without masks. The question wasn't whether she could survive Hawthorne's decision. Riley knew how to survive. The question was whether she could live with it. By the 5th day, she was summoned again. Henderson delivered the message himself, his expression unreadable. Temporary office, 1100. Riley's chest tightened. This was it. She dressed the same as every other day. Khaki uniform, hair pulled back, gloves on, but inside she felt the storm gathering. She looked at herself in the mirror before she left, at the eyes that had seen too much and hidden even more. Whatever happens, she whispered to her reflection, don't break. The facility's halls felt longer than ever as she walked them. Soldiers and contractors passed, nodding, moving in their rhythms, unaware that for Riley, every step might be the last as. At 10:58 hours, she stood outside the colonel's office, Henderson at her side. She drew a slow breath. The weight of years pressed on her shoulders. The ghosts pressed against her chest. When the door opened, she stepped inside. And for the first time since Afghanistan, Riley felt the ground tilt beneath her. Not from explosions, not from wreckage, but from the sheer uncertainty of what truth might cost. What if everything you are depends on one person's verdict? The door shut behind her with a soft click that sounded louder than gunfire. Riley stood in Colonel Hawthorne's office, the walls bare, the blinds half-drawn, light stripping the floor like bars of a cell. Henderson closed the door and remained by her side, posture straight but jaw tight. The colonel sat behind the desk, her expression unreadable, a single folder before her. She didn't move for several seconds, just studied Riley like a puzzle piece that didn't fit. Sit, she said finally. Riley obeyed. She kept her back straight, her gloves folded in her lap. She didn't let her eyes waver from the woman across the desk. I've reviewed everything, Hawthorne began. Her tone wasn't cold, but it wasn't warm either. The after-action reports, the casualty files, the photographs, and your performance records here at Fort. Riley's chest tightened, the photographs, the crash site. Her face staring back from the wreckage reports marked deceased, Ghost Division's grave. Hawthorne's eyes didn't soften. You are exactly who you claim to be, which means you are also exactly who you should not be. A soldier declared dead, a unit erased from record, a ghost that was never meant to return. Riley forced her breathing steady. Then you know why I disappeared, why I built this life. The colonel leaned back slightly, folding her hands. Yes, I understand your reasons, but understanding is not the same as condoning. The silence stretched. Riley felt the edges of it cut into her. You have violated protocol on a scale most cannot imagine, Hawthorne continued. Identity fraud, evasion of military authority, unauthorized access to restricted facilities. By all accounts, you should be in custody right now. Her voice sharpened, but not cruelly, like a blade being honed. And yet, your record here is extraordinary. You have improved reliability of weapons across this base. You've prevented malfunctions that could have cost lives. The letters from field commanders are clear. Your presence has saved soldiers. Riley said nothing. Words would only weaken what was already known. The colonel's gaze hardened. Do you see the position you've placed me in? Protocol demands your arrest. Morality suggests you've earned leniency, which weighs heavier. Riley's chest ached, but her voice was calm. I'm not asking for leniency or recognition, only the chance to keep serving in this way, quietly, without masks if possible. For the first time, Hawthorne leaned closer, her eyes sharp. And if I deny that, if I order you detained and processed, what then? Riley met her gaze without flinching. Then I accept it. The colonel studied her long, as if searching for cracks, but Riley didn't break. She couldn't. Breaking had already happened years ago in a valley in Afghanistan. What was left was something harder, steadier. Finally, Hawthorne spoke again, softer. You carry guilt. It bleeds out of every word, every silence. Survivor's guilt can eat a person alive, and yet you've channeled it into purpose. That is rare, dangerous but rare. Riley blinked, the words striking deeper than she expected. She hadn't spoken of guilt aloud in years. Hawthorne sat back, her tone measured. I have made my decision, but before I give it, I need one answer, a question only you can answer honestly. Her eyes locked onto Riley's. Why are you still here? Why not take the easy way out? New name, new city, new mask, you've proven you can vanish. Why stay? Riley's throat tightened. She could have offered tactics, convenience, strategy, but none of that was true, not really. She exhaled slowly. Because disappearing isn't living. Not anymore. The only way I can make peace with the ghosts is by making sure no one else has to carry them. If I can keep one soldier alive, one family whole, then maybe what happened to Ghost Division wasn't for nothing. Her voice caught at the last word. She let it. The colonel's gaze lingered, softer now, though still sharp. She closed the folder with a firm motion. You'll remain at Fort, she said finally. Your identity will remain classified at the highest level. As far as official record is concerned, you are Riley, civilian contractor. Nothing more, nothing less. Riley's breath stalled. She hadn't dared to expect those words. But understand this, Hawthorne continued, her tone sharp again. This is not absolution. This is utility. You are being permitted to remain because your value outweighs the risk for now. The moment that changes, I won't hesitate to act. Riley nodded once, understood. Hawthorne turned her gaze to Henderson. And you, Major, your silence will remain between us, but know this, you've gambled your career. Protecting her means you stand with her fate. Henderson's voice was steady. I already knew that. The colonel studied him a moment longer, then looked back at Riley. You are dismissed, both of you. They stood. Riley's legs felt heavier than they should, but steady. Henderson opened the door, and together they stepped back into the hallway. The air outside felt different. Not lighter, the weight remained, but different. Like carrying a pack you, finally adjusted to after miles of strain. They walked in silence until they reached the far corridor. Only then did Henderson glance at her. You're still here. Riley let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. For now. That night back in her apartment, she didn't unpack the bag by the door. She left it there. A reminder that survival was never guaranteed, that the line between erasure and existence was razor thin. But she also left her gloves on the table, unhidden, the skull insignia visible in the lamplight. Not as a mark of what she had been forced to bury, but as a reminder of what she had chosen to carry. Outside, the base moved on. Families laughed in the fading light. Soldiers prepared for deployments. Life continued, unaware of the ghost among them. Riley sat by the window, the sound of distant cadence calls drifting in the air. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to wonder if living in the open, even in the smallest way, was possible. She wasn't free, not fully, but she was no longer invisible. And sometimes that was enough. How long can a ghost walk among the living before they're noticed? Riley asked herself that question every day after Colonel Hawthorne's verdict. She was still here, still walking the halls of Fort, still adjusting scopes and tightening bolts, her gloves marked with the faint insignia no one was supposed to notice. But something had shifted. It wasn't Hawthorne's words echoing in her head, utility, not absolution. It was Henderson's loyalty pressing like a silent shield at her side. It was the way people looked at her now. Not everyone, not most. To 99% of the base, she was still the contractor, efficient, quiet, reliable, the one who returned rifles sharper than they arrived. But in the remaining 1%, the eyes of soldiers who had spent enough time in to recognize the weight of silence, she saw it. Recognition, not of her face but of her bearing, the way she moved, the way she handled a weapon, even just for inspection, The way her gaze lingered a second longer than necessary on exits, on shadows, on vulnerabilities. She caught it one afternoon when a sergeant from the 82nd brought in his squad's rifles. He watched her work with a look that wasn't just curiosity. His eyes narrowed slightly, as if trying to place her. He didn't ask questions, but he left quieter than he came in. Another time, a young private lingered too long at her table, watching the way she balanced a rifle before shouldering it for zeroing. The private's eyes widened, like a child realizing the substitute teacher might once have been something else entirely. These weren't confrontations, they weren't accusations, but they were cracks in the mask. Riley told herself it didn't matter. Hawthorne had made her decision. Henderson had staked his silence. Her presence was sanctioned now, if not celebrated. Still, the whispers pressed against her, invisible currents in the air tugging at the edges of her cover. Henderson noticed it too. They sat one evening in the corner of the mess, away from the noise of laughter and boots. He set down his coffee, his voice low. "You're being watched." Riley didn't look up from her tray. "I've been watched my whole life." "This is different," Henderson said. "They don't know who you are, but they sense it. Soldiers can smell it. The way you hold yourself, the way you breathe in a firefight you're not even in." Riley stabbed a piece of food with her fork, her movements precise, controlled. "Then let them sense. Recognition isn't the same as proof." "But it breeds questions," Henderson said quietly, "and questions have a way of finding ears they shouldn't." Riley finally looked at him. His face was calm, but his eyes carried the weight of someone who had chosen his side and knew what that choice cost. She gave a small nod. "Then we hold steady. Nothing more, nothing less." It became their unspoken pact, not defiance, not surrender, just endurance. Hawthorne, meanwhile, played her own game. She didn't summon Riley again directly, not at first, but her presence was felt in subtler ways. Files arriving later than usual, extra questions filtering down through supervisors, unscheduled inspections in the weapons bay. One morning, Riley arrived to find Hawthorne already there, speaking with a sergeant about rifle performance. The colonel turned casually, greeting Riley with the kind of polite neutrality that masked intent. "Miss," she said smoothly, "your work continues to impress. I'd like to observe your process if you don't mind." There was no refusing. Riley nodded, gloves steady, hands sure. She worked under the colonel's watchful eyes, every motion measured, cleaning, adjusting, calibrating. She could feel Hawthorne, not just the actions, but the discipline behind them, the way her body moved like a soldier's, not a technician's. When Riley finished, the colonel inspected the rifle herself, then set it down carefully. "Precise," she said. "Efficient, almost military." The words lingered between them, sharp as glass. Riley simply met her gaze. Tools don't care who handles them, only that they're handled right. Hawthorne studied her for a long moment, then nodded and left. The soldiers around them exchanged glances, none brave enough to voice what they'd just witnessed. Riley felt the eyes on her all day after that, whispers carried in silence. At night, back in her apartment, she sat at the small table with the bag still packed by the door. She hadn't touched it since that first night after Hawthorne's verdict. But she hadn't unpacked it either. Survival and belonging balanced on a knife's edge, and she couldn't decide which side to lean toward. She wrote again in the notebook. Short fragments, the smell of burning sand, the sound of laughing into static. The way silence felt heavier than screams after the crash. She wrote until her hand cramped, then closed the book and sat in the dark. One evening, Henderson knocked on her door. When she opened it, his face was tired, his eyes shadowed. He stepped inside without words, setting a bottle on the table. "No reports tonight," he said quietly. "No colonels, just space." They sat across from each other, drinking in silence. For a long time, neither spoke. Finally, Riley broke it. "You risked everything," she said softly. Henderson shook his head. "No, you did. I just stood where it mattered." The words sat between them, heavier than the silence. Riley felt something she hadn't allowed herself in years, gratitude that didn't come with guilt. They didn't talk about the war, or Ghost Division, or Hawthorne's eyes watching them from every shadow. They talked about small things the ocean Henderson missed, the sound of his daughter's laughter when he called home. Riley didn't offer much in return, but she listened. And listening, she realized, was its own kind of healing. As weeks turned into months, the balance held. Hawthorne didn't act against her, though Riley could feel the colonel's vigilance like a constant hum. Soldiers whispered, but no accusations surfaced. Henderson stood steady, his presence a quiet reminder that loyalty could still exist in a world of betrayal. And Riley, she kept working, rifle by rifle, bolt by bolt, life saved by unseen hands. But late at night, when the base was quiet and the ghosts returned, she knew the truth. This peace was fragile. One report, one slip, one curious soldier asking the wrong question in the wrong place. That was all it would take. So she held steady, silent, focused, a ghost walking among the living. Because sometimes survival isn't about winning. Sometimes it's about enduring long enough to give meaning to the silence. What does it mean to live as both ghost and guardian? Riley asked herself that in fragments, not in words. Every morning she stepped into the weapons bay, gloves tugged snug, tools arranged in neat rows, rifles stacked like unspoken promises. Every evening she left in silence, blending into the rhythm of soldiers who would never know her face, but would trust her hands without question. Colonel Hawthorne hadn't summoned her again, not directly, but the colonel's shadow never left. Riley could feel it in the subtle checks, the reports that trickled down, the presence at odd hours. Hawthorne wasn't watching for failure anymore, she was watching for proof. Proof she had been right to let Riley stay. Proof that ghosts could serve the living. Henderson noticed too. Some nights he would stop by the weapons bay as she worked late, leaning against the doorframe with his coffee. He never asked questions, never pressed. He just watched her steady hands move across steel, and sometimes that was enough to know someone else was there, holding the silence with her. But whispers grew, they always do. A rumor started, quiet as dust but impossible to sweep away. The contractor with the gloves wasn't just a contractor. She moved like someone trained, spoke like someone who had carried more weight than she admitted. The kind of rumor that couldn't be traced, only felt in the way soldiers glanced twice or straightened unconsciously when she walked past. One afternoon, a young lieutenant lingered by her table as she adjusted the optics on his rifle. He was polite, almost too polite, but curiosity burned in his eyes. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "did you ever serve before this?" Riley paused, for a heartbeat too long. Then she set the rifle down gently. "I serve now," she said simply. The lieutenant nodded, almost embarrassed, and left. But she knew that answer would only feed the whispers. That night she sat at her apartment table with the gloves in front of her. She traced the faint skull emblem with her thumb, the leather worn smooth by years. They weren't just gloves. They were a seal, a confession without words. She could have thrown them away long ago, burned them, buried them, but she hadn't. And deep down she knew why, because hiding wasn't the same as healing. And part of her needed the world to see, even if only in fragments, what she had carried and what she had survived. Days bled into weeks. The rhythm held. Work, silence, whispers. And then one evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the base in gold, Riley was called again. Not by formal summons, not by order, by presence. Colonel Hawthorne stepped into the bay, her stride quiet, her gaze sharp. The room stilled. Contractors pretended to busy themselves. Soldiers found excuses to move elsewhere. Riley stood at her bench, rifle in hand, waiting. Hawthorne walked up slowly, her eyes sweeping the room before fixing on Riley. She spoke softly, so only the two of them could hear. "Rumors travel," she said. "You know this." Riley's voice was steady. I know. Some wonder who you are, where you came from. What you've seen, they don't have answers, only questions. Riley set the rifle down, meeting her gaze. And what do you want them to have? The colonel studied her for a long moment. Then, to Riley's surprise, her voice softened. Sometimes questions serve better than answers. Soldiers don't need to know your past. They need to know their weapons will fire when it matters. And they do. That's enough. Riley blinked. Of all the verdicts she'd feared, this wasn't one. Not erasure, not exposure, but acceptance of the in-between. Hawthorne leaned closer, her tone almost reflective. Ghosts don't vanish, they walk beside us. Some terrify us, some guide us. You've chosen the latter, don't waste it. And just like that, she turned and left. No orders, no warnings, just a line cut into stone. Riley stood there long after, the weight of those words heavier than any weapon. That night she walked beyond the base, out to the fence line where the land stretched wide and open. The sky was painted with stars, clear and sharp, unbroken by city light. She stood with the gloves in her hands, the cool air biting her skin. For a long time, she considered letting them fall, leaving them in the dirt, walking away with nothing tying her to the valley in Afghanistan, to the wreckage, to the screams. But she didn't. Instead, she pulled them back on, not to hide, not to run, but to carry, to remember, to remind herself that silence wasn't absence. Silence was a form of service. She whispered the names again. Daniels, every one of them. The wind carried them into the night, not as ghosts, but as companions. Back at the base, life went on. Soldiers laughed in the mess, kids played in the yards, rifles were issued for missions that would never know her fingerprint steadied them. She blended into it all, unseen yet indispensable. Henderson saw her once at dusk, standing by the fence line, her silhouette sharp against the fading light. He didn't approach. He just watched, and in that quiet moment he understood. Some battles aren't fought with rifles. Some are fought by simply choosing to remain day after day when everything inside you tells you to disappear. Riley knew she would never be free. Not of the ghosts, not of the weight, but freedom wasn't the point. Purpose was. And in that fragile space between erasure and belonging, she found it. Because sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.